A knight is a person granted an honorary title of knighthood by a monarch or other political leader for service to the monarch or country, especially in a military capacity. Historically, in Europe, knighthood has been conferred upon mounted warriors. During the High Middle Ages, knighthood was considered a class of lower nobility. By the late Middle Ages, the rank had become associated with the ideals of chivalry, a code of conduct for the perfect courtly Christian warrior. Often, a knight was a vassal who served as a fighter for a lord, with payment in the form of land holdings. The lords trusted the knights, who were skilled in battle on horseback. Since the early modern period, the title of knight is purely honorific, usually bestowed by a monarch, as in the British honours system, often for non-military service to the country. The modern female equivalent is dame. Historically, the ideals of chivalry were popularized in medieval literature, especially the Matter of Britain and Matter of France. The former based on Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written in the 1130s. Sir Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, written in 1485, was important in defining the ideal of chivalry, which is essential to the modern concept of the knight as an elite warrior sworn to uphold the values of faith, loyalty, courage, and honor. Furthermore, Geoffroy de Charny's Book of Chivalry expounded upon the importance of Christian faith in every area of a knight's life. During the Renaissance, the genre of chivalric romance became popular in literature, growing ever more idealistic and eventually giving rise to a new form of realism in literature, popularized by Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote. This novel explored the ideals of knighthood and their incongruity with the reality of Cervantes' world. In the late medieval period, new methods of warfare began to render classical knights in armor obsolete, but the titles remained in many nations. Some orders of knighthood, such as the Knights Templar, have become the subject of legend, others have disappeared into obscurity. Today, a number of orders of knighthood continue to exist in several countries, such as the English Order of the Garter, the Swedish Royal Order of the Seraphim, and the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olav. Each of these orders has its own criteria for eligibility, but knighthood is generally granted by a head of state to selected persons to recognize some meritorious achievement. Knighthood in the Middle Ages was closely linked with horsemanship from its origins in the 12th century until its final flowering as a fashion among the high nobility in the Duchy of Burgundy in the 15th century. This linkage is reflected in the etymology of chivalry, cavalier and related terms. The special prestige given to mounted warriors finds a parallel in the faizia in the Muslim world, and the Greek hippos and the Roman eques of classical antiquity. Etymology. The word knight, from Old English kniht, is a cognate of the German word knecht. This meaning, of unknown origin, is common among West Germanic languages. Anglo-Saxon kniht had no particular connection to horsemanship, referring to any servant. A radsneet was a servant delivering messages or patrolling coastlines on horseback. Old English that had the meaning of adolescence by 1300. A narrowing of the generic meaning, servant, to military follower of a king or other superior, is visible by 1100. The specific military sense of a knight being a mounted warrior in the heavy cavalry emerges only in the 100 Years' War. An equestrian was a member of the second highest social class in the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire. This class is often translated as knight. The medieval knight, however, was called miles in Latin. Both Greek hippos and Latin equus are derived from the Proto-Indo-European word root equo, meaning horse. In the later Roman Empire, the classical Latin word for horse, equus, was replaced in common parlance by Vulgar Latin caballus, sometimes thought to derive from Gaulish caballos. From caballus arose terms in the various Romance languages cognate to the English cavalier, Italian cavalier, Spanish caballero, French chevalier, Portuguese cavaleiro, Romanian cavalier. The Germanic languages feature terms cognate to the English rider, German Ritter, and Dutch and Scandinavian Ridder. These words are cognates derived from Germanic riden, to ride, derived from the Proto-Indo-European root reed. Origins of medieval knighthood. Pre-Carolingian legacies. In ancient Rome there was a knightly class, ordo equestris, from which European knighthood may have been derived. Some portions of the armies of Germanic peoples who occupied Europe from the 3rd century AD onward had been mounted, and some armies, such as those of the Ostrogoths, were mainly cavalry. However, it was the Franks who generally fielded armies composed of large masses of infantry, with an infantry elite, the comitatus, which often rode to battle on horseback rather than marching on foot. When the armies of the Frankish ruler Charles Martel defeated the Umayyad Arab invasion at the Battle of Tours in 732, the Frankish forces were still largely infantry armies, with elites riding to battle but dismounting to fight. Carolingian age. In the early medieval period, any well-equipped horseman could be described as a knight, or miles in Latin. The first knights appeared during the reign of Charlemagne in the 8th century. As the Carolingian age progressed, the Franks were generally on the attack, and larger numbers of warriors took to their horses to ride with the emperor in his wide-ranging campaigns of conquest. At about this time the Franks increasingly remained on horseback to fight on the battlefield as true cavalry, rather than as mounted infantry with the discovery of the stirrup, and would continue to do so for centuries thereafter, although in some nations the knight returned to foot combat in the 14th century. The association of the knight with mounted combat with a spear, and later a lance, remained a strong one. The older Carolingian ceremony of presenting a young man with weapons influenced the emergence of knighthood ceremonies, in which a noble would be ritually given weapons and declared to be a knight, usually amid some festivities. These mobile mounted warriors made Charlemagne's far-flung conquests possible, and to secure their service he rewarded them with grants of land called benefices. These were given to the captains directly by the emperor to reward their efforts in the conquests, and they in turn were to grant benefices to their warrior contingents, who were a mix of free and unfree men. In the century or so following Charlemagne's death, his newly empowered warrior class grew stronger still, and Charles the Bald declared their fiefs to be hereditary. The period of chaos in the 9th and 10th centuries, between the fall of the Carolingian central authority and the rise of separate Western and Eastern Frankish kingdoms, only entrenched this newly landed warrior class. This was because governing power, and defense against Viking, Magyar and Saracen attack, became an essentially local affair which revolved around these new hereditary local lords and their domains. Crusades. In the course of the 12th century, knighthood became a social rank, with a distinction being made between milites gregarii and milites nobiles. As the term knight became increasingly confined to denoting a social rank, the military role of fully armored cavalrymen gained a separate term, man-at-arms. Although any medieval knight going to war would automatically serve as a man-at-arms, not all men-at-arms were knights. The first military orders of knighthood were of Knights Hospitaller and of the Holy Sepulchre, both founded at the First Crusade of 1099, followed by the Knights Templar and the Order of St. Lazarus. At the time of their foundation, these were intended as monastic orders, whose members would act as simple soldiers protecting pilgrims. It was only over the following century, with the successful conquest of the Holy Land and the rise of the Crusader states, that these orders became powerful and prestigious. The great European legends of warriors such as the Paladins and the Matter of Britain popularized the notion of chivalry among the warrior class. The ideal of chivalry, as the ethos of the Christian warrior, and the transmutation of the term knight from the meaning servant, soldier, and of chevalier, mounted soldier, to refer to a member of this ideal class, is significantly influenced by the Crusades. on one hand inspired by the military orders of monastic warriors, and on the other hand also cross-influenced by Islamic ideals of Faiziya culture. Training. The institution of knights were already well established by the 10th century. While the knight was essentially a position denoting a military officer, the term can also be used on positions of higher nobility such as landholders. The higher nobles grant the vassals their fiefs or portions of land in return for their loyalty, protection and service. They also provided their necessities such as lodging, food, armor, weapons, horses and money. The knight generally held his lands by military tenure, which are measured through military service that usually lasts 40 days a year. This military service were exchanged for each fief given to the knights. Vassals and lords can own any number of knights, although those with more military experience are the ones sought after. Thus all nobles who are on the path of becoming knights must have a great deal of military exploits. A knight fighting under another's banner was called a knight bachelor, while a knight fighting under his own banner was a knight banneret. In order to become a knight, one must be born of nobility, typically sons of knights or lords. In some cases commoners can also apply for knighthood when awarded so. Children of nobility were cared for by women in castle until they reached the age of 7. They were then bestowed the title of page and are placed in the care of their lords. They would undergo a training regime consisting of hunting with huntsmen and falconers, and academic studies with priests or chaplains. Pages then become assistants to older knights in battle, carrying and cleaning armor, taking care of the horses and packing the baggage. They would accompany the knights in their expeditions, even those in foreign lands. Soon they are taught by older knights in swordsmanship, equestrianism, chivalry, warfare and combat using wooden swords and spears. When the young boy turns 14, he then succeeds to the title squire. In a religious ceremony, the new squire then swears to a consecrated sword with a bishop or priest, and he soon takes his place in his lord's household and attends to his duties. During this time they continue their training in combat and are now able to get hold of their own armor. He must master the prerequisite skills to becoming a knight, known as the 7 points of agilities: riding, swimming and diving, shooting different types of weapons, climbing, participation in tournaments, wrestling, fencing, long jumping and dancing, all of which are done even while wearing armor. Upon turning 21, a squire was ready to be knighted. Accolade. The accolade or knighting ceremony was usually held during one of the great feasts or holidays, like Christmas or Easter, and sometimes in the wedding of a noble or royal. The knighting ceremony usually involved a ritual bath on the eve of the ceremony, and in the night they do a prayer vigil. In the day of ceremony, the would-be knight would swear an oath and the master of the ceremony would dub the new knight on the shoulders with a sword. Squires can also be awarded knighthood early if they show valor and efficiency in battle. Chivalric code knights were expected, above all, to fight bravely and to display military professionalism and courtesy. When knights were taken as prisoners of war, they were customarily held for ransom in somewhat comfortable surroundings. This same standard of conduct did not apply to non-knights, who were often slaughtered after capture, and who were viewed during battle as mere impediments to knights getting to other knights to fight them. Chivalry developed as an early standard of professional ethics for knights, who were relatively affluent horse owners and were expected to provide military services in exchange for landed property. Early notions of chivalry entailed loyalty to one's liege lord and bravery in battle, similar to the values of the heroic age. During the Middle Ages, this grew from simple military professionalism into a social code including the values of gentility, nobility and treating others reasonably. In the Song of Roland, Roland is portrayed as the ideal knight, demonstrating unwavering loyalty, military prowess and social fellowship. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, chivalry had become a blend of religious duties, love and military service. Ramon Lull's Book of the Order of Chivalry demonstrates that by the end of the 13th century, chivalry entailed a litany of very specific duties. including riding war horses, jousting, attending tournaments, holding round tables and hunting, as well as aspiring to the more ethereal virtues of faith, hope, charity, justice, strength, moderation and loyalty. Knights of the late medieval era were expected by society to maintain all these skills and many more, as outlined in Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, though the book's protagonist, Count Ludovico, states the first and true profession of the ideal courtier must be that of arms, chivalry, derived from the French word chevalier. Chivalry and religion were mutually influenced during the period of the Crusades. The early Crusades helped to clarify the moral code of chivalry as it related to religion. As a result, Christian armies began to devote their efforts to sacred purposes. As time passed, clergy instituted religious vows which required knights to use their weapons chiefly for the protection of the weak and defenseless, especially women and orphans, and of churches. With the rise of Renaissance humanism and moral relativism, the knight and chivalry along with him lost much of his relevance to society, and the idealism of chivalric romance was fundamentally rejected in Niccolò Machiavelli's Il Principe and more directly derided in Miguel de Cervantes's Don Quixote. The medieval literary genre of chivalric romance had been the high-water mark of idealism and romanticism in literature, but in the 16th century Machiavelli instructed aspiring political rulers to be ruthlessly pragmatic and to apply the principle that the ends justify the means, directly counter to the high-flown idealism of late medieval chivalry. Later, the high-flown values of chivalric romance were heavily satirized in Cervantes's Don Quixote, which portrayed the charmingly idealistic protagonist as a lovable but hopelessly delusional imbecile. Tournaments in peacetime. Knights often demonstrated their martial skills in tournaments, which usually took place on the grounds of a castle. Knights can parade their armor and banner to the whole court as the tournament commences. Medieval tournaments were made up of martial sports called haste-eludes, and were not only a major spectator sport but also played as a real combat simulation. It usually ended with many knights either injured or even killed. One contest was a free-for-all battle called a melee, where large groups of knights numbering hundreds assembled and fought one another, and the last knight standing was the winner. The most popular and romanticized contest for knights was the joust. In this competition, two knights charge each other with blunt wooden lances in an effort to break their lance on the opponent's head or body, or unhorse them completely. The loser in these tournaments had to turn his armor and horse over to the victor. The last day was filled with feasting, dancing and minstrel singing. Besides formal tournaments, there were also unformalized judicial duels done by knights and squires to end various disputes. Countries like Germany, Britain and Ireland practiced this tradition. Judicial combat were of two forms in medieval society: the feat of arms and chivalric combat. The feat of arms were done to settle hostilities between two large parties and supervised by a judge. The chivalric combat was fought when one party's honor was disrespected or challenged upon, in which the conflict cannot be resolved in court. Weapons were standardized and must be of the same caliber. The duel lasted until the other party was too weak to fight back, and in early cases, the defeated party were then subsequently executed. A farm or chivalric duel which became popular in the late Middle Ages was the Pas d'Armes, passage of arms. In this haste-elude, a knight or a group of knights would claim a bridge, lane or city gate, and challenge other passing knights to fight or be disgraced. If a lady passed unescorted, she would leave behind a glove or scarf, to be rescued and returned to her by a future knight who passed that way. Heraldry. One of the greatest distinguishing marks of the knightly class was the flying of colored banners, to display power and to distinguish knights in battle and in tournaments. Knights are generally armigerous, and indeed they played an essential role in the development of heraldry, as heavier armor, including enlarged shields and enclosed helmets, developed in the Middle Ages. the need for marks of identification arose, and with colored shields and surcoats, Kotamri was born. Memorial rolls were created to record the knights of various regions or those who participated in various tournaments.